On a cold Tuesday morning in March 1987, the first convoy of flatbed trucks rolled through the gravel entrance of Margaret Lawson's farm in Adams County, Nebraska. There were 43 trucks before noon. Another 50 arrived before sunset. Every trailer carried enormous reinforced concrete drainage pipes, each measuring 8 feet across, weighing nearly 11,000 pounds, their gray surfaces still marked with fresh casting dates from a factory outside Grand Island. By the end of the week, more than 2,700 pipes rested in neat rows across 80 acres of her pasture. Nobody in town understood why. Neither did Margaret. She simply stood beside the fence in faded denim overalls, one weathered hand resting on the handle of a shovel that had belonged to her late husband, and watched the trucks keep coming. She was 71 years old. She had worked that same land for 47 seasons. She had buried a husband, raised 2 children, survived droughts in 1974 and 1980, outlived 3 banks, and in all those years, she had never seen anything quite like this. The foreman finally climbed down from his truck. His name was Richard Ellis, 36 years old, project manager for Midwest Infrastructure Contractors, a rapidly growing construction company that had just won a multimillion-dollar drainage contract stretching across eastern Nebraska. He unfolded a county map on the hood of his pickup. "We only need temporary storage," he explained. 6 months. Maybe 8. Margaret looked at the map, then at the endless line of trucks still waiting on the county road. "That's a lot of temporary." Richard laughed politely. "You'd be surprised." She didn't answer. She simply watched another truck back into the field. Let me tell you about Margaret Lawson. She wasn't born on that farm. She married into it in 1943, when returning Army mechanic Thomas Lawson bought 160 acres with help from the GI Bill and a loan of $8,900 through the local Agricultural Credit Association. Together they built a dairy operation before gradually converting to corn, soybeans, and alfalfa during the 1960s as markets changed. Every improvement on the property had been earned the slow way, with harvest after harvest, payment after payment, year after year. Thomas believed machinery deserved respect because every machine represented someone's sacrifice. His favorite was a 1952 Farmall M, 44 horsepower, purchased new from a dealer in Hastings, Nebraska, for $2,380. The tractor still lived inside the red barn. Original cast wheels. Original seat. The engine had never been rebuilt. Every October, Margaret changed the oil herself. Every spring, she polished the faded red hood with the same cotton cloth Thomas had always used. Most people saw an old tractor. She saw 50 years of mornings that began before sunrise. The company signed a storage agreement with her for $3,000. Enough money to repair several leaking roofs. Enough to replace broken fencing. Enough to pay property taxes comfortably. Nothing about the arrangement seemed unusual. At first. Then the digging started. Not for foundations. Not for utilities. For burial. Huge trenching machines carved long channels through the western pasture. Bulldozers pushed soil aside. Massive cranes lowered concrete pipes underground instead of stacking them above the surface. Margaret frowned. "You said storage." Richard smiled. "It is. Then why bury them? They'll be safer underground." She studied him for several seconds. Finally, she nodded once. "If you say so." Within 3 weeks, almost every pipe had disappeared beneath carefully graded earth. Fresh grass seed covered the disturbed ground. From the road, it looked as though nothing had ever happened. Except Margaret knew exactly where every trench had been. She had watched every bucket of dirt move. Word spread quickly through Adams County. Coffee shops filled with speculation. Some believed the company had hidden defective products. Others insisted it was government property. One man claimed they were preparing secret flood tunnels. Nobody really knew. What everyone did know was that Margaret had allowed it. And that became enough for gossip. The loudest criticism came from Kevin Brooks, vice president of the Regional Agricultural Bank. 38 years old. College educated. Sharp suit. Brand new pickup every other year. Kevin had financed dozens of modern farming operations. He admired efficiency, expansion, technology. Everything Margaret's old farm seemed to reject. One Saturday morning, during breakfast at the corner cafe, Kevin spotted Margaret sitting alone with coffee and scrambled eggs. Several farmers occupied nearby tables. "So," Kevin called loudly enough for half the room to hear, "how's the underground pipe warehouse?" The room chuckled. Margaret looked up calmly. "They're just pipes." Kevin laughed harder. "Sure they are." Someone else joined in. Before long, the whole cafe echoed with laughter. Kevin leaned against her table. "You know," he said, "companies don't bury millions of dollars worth of concrete because they're bored." More laughter. Margaret folded her napkin carefully. "I expect they had their reasons." "And you didn't ask?" "I asked. And they answered." Kevin shook his head. "You trusted them?" "I trusted the paper we both signed." Another wave of laughter rolled across the room. Margaret stood slowly. No anger. No embarrassment. She placed exact change beside her coffee cup, looked Kevin directly in the eyes, then spoke so quietly everyone had to stop talking to hear her. "My husband always said people explain themselves twice." Kevin smiled. "What does that mean?" "It means the first explanation usually isn't the real one." Then she walked out. No dramatic exit. No slammed door. Only the soft sound of her boots crossing old wooden floorboards. For several moments nobody spoke. Kevin finally shrugged. "She's stubborn." Maybe she was. Or maybe she had noticed something nobody else had. Spring turned into summer. Summer became autumn. The company never returned. 6 months became a year. Richard stopped answering letters. The regional office closed. Construction equipment disappeared from Nebraska. The buried pipes remained exactly where they were. Grass covered every trench. Cattle grazed peacefully overhead. Life returned to normal. Mostly. Margaret continued planting corn using the old Farmel M for lighter work around the barns, while a neighbor handled larger field operations with a John Deere 4440. Every evening she walked across the western pasture before sunset. She never carried tools. Never dug. She simply stood in different places for several minutes as if listening to the ground itself. Neighbors thought it was grief. Some thought age. Others thought loneliness. Only Margaret knew she was remembering where every buried line began and where everyone ended. Have you ever watched everyone dismiss something you couldn't stop thinking about, even when you couldn't explain why it mattered? Because that quiet feeling is sometimes the only warning life ever gives you. Then, in April 1990, exactly 3 years after the first trucks arrived, a black sedan pulled into Margaret's driveway carrying 3 men in expensive suits. None of them smiled. And the first sentence out of their mouths changed everything. The oldest of the 3 men removed his hat before speaking. "Mrs. Lawson." Margaret nodded once. "We're here regarding the concrete drainage inventory stored on your property under the March 1987 agreement." She looked from one face to the next. None of them were Richard Ellis. None of them had stood in her pasture while thousands of tons of concrete disappeared beneath her soil. "So," she said quietly, "someone finally remembered where they left them." The youngest man forced a nervous smile. The oldest didn't. "My name is Charles Benton. I'm legal counsel for Midwest Infrastructure Contractors." He held out a leather folder. "We'd like immediate access to recover all materials." Margaret didn't touch the folder. "Immediate?" "Yes." "You said 6 months." Charles cleared his throat. "There were corporate complications." "I noticed." For several seconds, only the wind moved. Then Margaret asked the question that made all 3 men glance at one another. "Where's Richard Ellis?" "He no longer works for the company." "Didn't leave willingly, did he?" Charles avoided the question. "We're prepared to compensate you for any inconvenience." Margaret folded her arms. "The inconvenience happened 3 years ago." They offered $5,000. She declined. They raised it to $12,000. She still declined. Finally Charles asked the obvious question. "What exactly do you want?" Margaret looked toward the western pasture. "I want to know why you're suddenly in such a hurry." No one answered. Instead, Charles handed her a business card. "We'll return next week." They drove away without another word. Margaret watched the black sedan disappear over the hill before walking toward the old red barn. The Farmel M waited exactly where it always had. Dust floated through shafts of afternoon sunlight. She rested one hand on the tractor's faded hood. "I think they finally came back, Tom." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Then she climbed into the seat. The old four-cylinder engine coughed once, twice, then settled into the deep, familiar rhythm she had known for decades. Not because she needed to plow. Not because she had work to do. She simply needed to think. Let me tell you about that 1952 Farmel M. People often remember horsepower. They rarely remember reliability. International Harvester rated the Farmel M at roughly 44 belt horsepower and just over 38 drawbar horsepower, enough to pull a 3-bottom plow through Nebraska loam without complaint. It weighed close to 5,500 pounds, almost entirely cast iron and steel. There were no computers, no electronic sensors, no plastic engine covers hiding complicated systems. Thomas Lawson used to say you could hear when the engine was happy because it settled into a steady, patient rhythm that sounded almost human. That tractor had planted every crop on the farm for nearly 40 years. It had pulled children on hay wagons. It had hauled lumber for new barns. It had carried Thomas home after long harvest days. Machines like that didn't just perform work. They collected memories. Margaret drove slowly across the pasture. The grass looked perfectly ordinary. But she noticed something nobody else ever had. Several narrow depressions had appeared after 3 unusually wet springs. Nothing dramatic. Just shallow lines. Almost invisible. They followed the exact route where the buried pipes rested. She climbed down. Knelt. Pressed her weathered hand against the soil. It felt cooler there. She couldn't explain why. She simply noticed. That evening she unfolded every document the company had ever signed. Storage agreement. Property survey. Insurance certificate. County permits. Everything looked proper. Except one sentence. One single sentence buried on page 6. Stored materials remain the exclusive property of Midwest infrastructure contractors unless otherwise governed by applicable Nebraska statutes regarding abandoned commercial property. Margaret read it again. And again. Then she walked to the bookshelf, pulled down an old volume containing Nebraska property laws that Thomas had bought years earlier after a boundary dispute with a neighboring ranch. She searched until midnight. The answer wasn't there. The next morning she drove to the courthouse in Hastings. County Clerk Dorothy Jensen welcomed her with coffee. "What brings you in?" Margaret placed the agreement on the desk. "I need to understand something." Dorothy adjusted her glasses. An hour later she looked up slowly. "That's interesting." "What is?" "This agreement references an abandoned property statute." So the law changed in 1988. Margaret frowned. "Changed how?" Dorothy disappeared into a records room. She returned carrying a thick binder. The legislature updated commercial storage timelines. Margaret waited. If stored industrial property is abandoned beyond the contractual period without reasonable communication, ownership questions become complicated. Complicated. Dorothy smiled slightly. "Very." Margaret drove home thinking about one word. Complicated. Meanwhile, in Omaha, Charles Benton sat through a tense board meeting. The company wasn't simply trying to recover old drainage pipes. Those exact reinforced concrete sections had been manufactured to specifications no longer produced after the factory that cast them permanently closed in 1988. Replacing them today would cost nearly $9.4 million. The state had just approved a massive flood control expansion requiring identical dimensions. Without those buried pipes, the contract would collapse. The company would face enormous penalties. One executive slammed his fist onto the conference table. "Get them back." Another asked quietly, "What if she refuses?" Charles answered honestly, "Then we're in trouble." Back in Adams County, rumors returned. People noticed unfamiliar company vehicles driving slowly along county roads. Survey crews appeared. Engineers carried measuring equipment. The local newspaper published a short article mentioning previously stored construction materials. Kevin Brooks read it over breakfast. His confidence returned immediately. He drove straight to Margaret's farm. She was repairing an old gate when he arrived. "You've got visitors again. I noticed." Kevin leaned against the fence. "You know." She kept tightening a bolt. "If those pipes are worth what people are saying, you've got some leverage." She looked up. "You've changed your tune." He smiled awkwardly. "I may have underestimated things." You laughed. "I did. I'm not offended." "You should be." Margaret shrugged gently. "Laughter doesn't break bones." Kevin looked away. For the first time since she'd met him, he seemed uncomfortable. "Mrs. Lawson." "Yes. I think I owe you an apology." She studied him carefully. "I'll know if you mean it." He nodded. "I do." Silence settled between them. Finally, Margaret smiled. A small smile. Almost invisible. "That's a good place to start." Kevin left feeling strangely lighter. The apology hadn't solved anything. But it had changed him. Have you ever realized the person you doubted understood the situation better than you ever did? It's an uncomfortable feeling. But it's also how wisdom usually begins. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived. Midwest infrastructure contractors formally demanded unrestricted access to remove every buried pipe within 30 days. Failure to comply, the letter warned, would result in legal action. Margaret folded the letter neatly, placed it beside Thomas's old photograph, then started the Formel M. She drove directly to the western pasture, stopped over the longest buried row, looked across 80 quiet acres, and for the first time in 3 years, she noticed fresh orange survey flags that she had never seen before. Someone had entered her land during the night, without permission, without telling her. She followed the flags until they ended at a single wooden stake driven deep into the ground. Attached to it was a strip of white tape. Written across it in black marker were 4 words. "Dig here first." Margaret stood over the wooden stake for nearly a minute without touching it. The wind bent the grass. A meadowlark landed on a fence post. Somewhere beyond the hill, the Formel M idled with its familiar, patient rumble, as if it already understood that this morning was different from every other morning before it. Finally, she bent down. The stake hadn't been driven by accident. It was nearly 18 inches into the ground. Whoever placed it knew exactly where the buried pipeline began. She pulled it free. The soil around it was fresh, no more than a day old. Someone had been on her property after sunset. She carried the stake back to the farmhouse and telephoned the Adams County Sheriff's Office. Deputy Harold McMillan arrived within 45 minutes. He examined the tire tracks crossing the western gate. "They didn't even try to hide them," he said. Margaret handed him the survey stake. "I've never seen it before yesterday." Harold nodded. "I believe you." He photographed the tracks, measured the ruts, and wrote several pages of notes. Before leaving, he stopped beside the Formel M. "My father had one just like this." Margaret smiled. "They're getting harder to find. So are people who know how to keep them running." She watched him drive away, then looked once more across the pasture. The company wasn't waiting for permission anymore. It was preparing for something. 3 days later, the answer arrived. At exactly 8:15 on Monday morning, 6 white company pickups rolled through the entrance. Behind them came 2 lowboy trailers carrying a Caterpillar 235 hydraulic excavator, nearly 52,000 pounds of yellow steel, and a Case 850 crawler dozer. Charles Benton stepped from the lead truck. "We're beginning recovery operations." Margaret remained standing on her porch. "You don't have permission." "Our engineers believe we do." "You believe wrong." Charles unfolded another folder. "We filed an emergency petition." "You filed it?" "Yes." "It hasn't been decided." "No." "Then nothing gets dug." Charles sighed. "Mrs. Lawson, every day this project waits costs us nearly $40,000. She answered without raising her voice. "That sounds expensive." Workers exchanged nervous glances. One operator climbed into the excavator anyway. The diesel engine roared to life. Its boom lifted slowly toward the first survey marker. Deputy McMillan's patrol truck appeared before the bucket ever touched the ground. The flashing lights were impossible to ignore. The operator shut the machine off. Nobody argued. Nobody had expected law enforcement to arrive that quickly. Charles rubbed his forehead. "We're wasting valuable time." Harold answered calmly. "Not as valuable as a court order." The company packed up before sunset. But everyone understood they would be back. Let me tell you about Richard Ellis. Most people in Adams County assumed he had simply disappeared after the storage project ended. The truth was very different. Richard had resigned in November 1987, barely 8 months after the last pipe disappeared underground. Not because the project failed. Because he discovered something that frightened him. The original engineering plans never called for the pipes to be buried. They were supposed to remain stacked above ground for temporary storage until the drainage project resumed. The burial order came later. From corporate headquarters. Richard questioned it. He never received a straight answer. Instead, he was instructed to sign revised paperwork showing the pipes had been secured below grade for environmental protection. He refused. Within 2 weeks, he was transferred. Within 2 months, he resigned. He had spent the next 3 years working for a small engineering firm in Lincoln, trying to forget the entire project. Until Margaret's name appeared in the newspaper. That evening, Richard drove 2 hours to Adams County. Margaret answered the knock herself. She recognized him instantly. "I wondered if you'd ever come back." He looked older than 39. More tired. "I should have come sooner." They sat at the same oak kitchen table where Thomas had once balanced farm accounts every winter. Richard removed a weathered envelope from his briefcase. "I kept copies." "Copies of what?" "The original plans." Margaret unfolded the yellowing blueprints. The trenches were there. The pipe locations were there. But something else caught her attention. A bold red line crossed directly beneath the western pasture. She pointed. "What's this?" Richard took a deep breath. "A proposed county drainage corridor." "I don't understand." "The pipes weren't buried because they needed storage." He paused. "They were buried because the company believed this land would eventually be condemned for a public flood control project." Margaret looked up slowly. "They expected the county to buy my farm." "Yes. And then?" "They could recover every pipe without paying storage, transportation, or relocation costs." Silence filled the room. The entire arrangement suddenly made sense. $3,000. Years of silence. The buried inventory. The urgency. Everything fit together. Except one thing. The county never condemned the land. Richard nodded. The project was canceled in late 1988 after federal funding disappeared. So they lost access. They lost everything. Margaret folded the blueprint carefully. "They gambled." Richard nodded again. "And now they're desperate." The following week, the case reached the Adams County District Court. The courtroom overflowed with farmers, contractors, bankers, and reporters. Even Kevin Brooks occupied a seat near the back. Charles Benton argued first. The materials remain company property. Margaret's attorney, Helen Crawford, stood slowly. "We don't dispute the original ownership." Charles smiled. Helen continued. "We dispute abandonment." The smile faded. She presented the original contract. 3 years of unanswered letters. Closed offices. Returned mail. Unused access rights. Photographs showing untouched ground. County records. Sheriff reports. Everything built one quiet fact upon another. The company had disappeared. Then Helen introduced Richard Ellis. Charles looked genuinely shocked. Richard testified under oath. He described the revised plans. The buried storage decision. The cancelled corridor. The missing communication. No drama. Only facts. One by one. Then Helen called Margaret. She walked to the witness stand wearing the same brown work boots she wore every day. The judge asked why she had never disturbed the buried pipes. Her answer filled the silent courtroom. Because they weren't mine to use. Helen asked another question. Then why fight to keep them now? Margaret looked toward Charles. Then toward Kevin. Finally at the judge. Because respecting someone else's property doesn't give them permission to stop respecting mine. No one spoke. Even Charles lowered his eyes. Have you ever been in a room where one quiet sentence carried more weight than an hour of arguments? Those moments are rare. But when they happen, everyone remembers exactly where they were standing. Court recessed until the following morning. Outside, reporters crowded the courthouse steps. Nobody noticed Kevin walking toward Margaret. He removed his hat. I laughed at you in the cafe. You did. I've thought about that almost every week. Margaret smiled gently. I believe you. Kevin looked across the courthouse lawn. I spent years believing experience could be replaced by spreadsheets. And now, I think I had that backwards. Margaret extended her hand. Kevin shook it. Not as a banker. Not as someone trying to win a customer. Simply as one farmer's neighbor finally admitting another had seen farther than he had. The next morning, before the judge returned to the bench, a court clerk hurried into the courtroom carrying a freshly delivered document from the Nebraska Department of Transportation. The judge read the first page, then looked directly at both legal teams. His expression changed immediately. Whatever was written in that letter had just transformed the entire case. The courtroom became so quiet that the old ceiling fan was suddenly the loudest sound in the room. Judge Harold Whitaker adjusted his glasses and read the first page again. Then he looked toward Charles Benton. Counselor, were you aware of this document? Charles slowly stood. No, Your Honor. The judge lifted the letter. It appears the Nebraska Department of Transportation has confirmed that the proposed drainage corridor beneath Mrs. Lawson's property was permanently abandoned in September 1988. No one moved. The judge continued. It further states that no public agency has claimed, leased, or reserved any future right to these buried materials. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Charles opened his briefcase frantically, searching for something that wasn't there. The judge wasn't finished. The department also confirms that your company was notified of the cancellation on October 14, 1988, by certified mail. Helen Crawford didn't smile. She simply waited. The judge looked back at Charles. Did your client attempt to recover the materials after receiving that notice? Charles hesitated. No, Your Honor. Did your client contact Mrs. Lawson during the following 3 years? No. Were property taxes paid on the land where these materials remained buried? By Mrs. Lawson. Were maintenance, liability, and insurance on that land also her responsibility? Yes. Another silence settled over the courtroom. The judge closed the file. Then this court must determine whether ownership alone survives when responsibility has been abandoned. It took less than 30 minutes. When Judge Whitaker returned from chambers, every seat in the courtroom was filled. His decision was direct. The court finds that Midwest infrastructure contractors failed to exercise reasonable care over its property for a period substantially exceeding the contractual agreement. He paused. The company ignored repeated opportunities to recover its inventory, ceased communication with the landowner, abandoned the storage arrangement, and transferred every practical burden to Mrs. Lawson. Charles lowered his head. The judge continued. Therefore, the company no longer possesses unrestricted access to the property. Margaret remained perfectly still. The materials may only be removed through a new negotiated agreement approved by both parties. A wave of whispers rolled through the courtroom. The company had not technically lost ownership, but they had lost control. Without Margaret's consent, not a single pipe could leave her pasture. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Charles. He answered only one question. We'll be speaking with Mrs. Lawson. This time, the meeting happened in her farmhouse instead of a courtroom. No lawyers spoke first. No one rushed. Charles finally broke the silence. What would be fair? Margaret poured coffee for everyone before answering. My husband believed agreements should leave both people able to shake hands afterward. Charles nodded. What do you want? I want every acre restored exactly as it was. It will be. I want every drainage trench repaired. Done. I want every fence replaced. Done. I want compensation for 3 years of occupied land. Charles wrote notes. And Margaret looked out the kitchen window toward the western pasture. You'll remove every pipe without damaging the topsoil. Charles smiled faintly. Our engineers can do that. She looked back at him. I wasn't finished. The smile disappeared. The Farmel M will pull the first pipe. Charles blinked. I'm sorry. My husband put that tractor on this farm in 1952. She rested her hand on the table. It watched every one of those pipes go into the ground. It deserves to watch the first one come out. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Charles smiled. A fair request. The agreement was signed 2 weeks later. The company paid $1.86 million in compensation, restoration costs, and revised storage fees. For Midwest infrastructure contractors, it was painful. For Margaret, it was never about becoming wealthy. It was about finishing something honestly. On June 18, 1990, nearly 300 people gathered along the edge of the western pasture. Farmers, neighbors, county officials, reporters, even school children. The Caterpillar excavator carefully removed the first layer of soil. Slowly, the curved edge of gray concrete emerged after 3 years underground. Workers attached heavy lifting chains. Charles walked toward Margaret. Ready? She nodded. The old Farmel M rolled forward at little more than walking speed. Its familiar 4-cylinder engine echoed across the pasture. The chains tightened. The tractor wasn't lifting 11,000 pounds. The excavator carried almost all of the weight. But the Farmel provided the first pull. Just enough to break the years of stillness. The concrete pipe shifted. An inch. Then another. Then sunlight touched its surface for the first time since 1987. The crowd applauded. Margaret didn't. She simply rested one hand on the steering wheel. Quietly. Respectfully. As though greeting an old neighbor. Let me tell you something about torque and horsepower. People often confuse the two, but they're very different. Horsepower tells you how quickly an engine can do work. Torque tells you how strongly it can twist. Old tractors like the Farmel M became legends not because they were fast, but because their long-stroke engines produced steady pulling force at low engine speeds. That meant they could keep moving heavy loads without racing the engine or stressing every internal part. Modern machines often deliver impressive horsepower numbers, but many older tractors earned their reputation by delivering dependable torque hour after hour, season after season. That's why so many are still working generations later. They were engineered to pull with patience instead of speed. Pipe after pipe emerged over the following months. Nearly all remained in remarkable condition. The company completed its flood control contract the following year. Charles Benton insisted every restoration promise be fulfilled. New topsoil was spread. Native grasses were replanted. Drainage patterns were restored. By the autumn of 1991, it was difficult to tell that thousands of tons of concrete had ever rested beneath the pasture. 5 years passed. Then 10. Margaret never spent much of the settlement money on herself. Instead, she repaired every barn, established agricultural scholarships at the local high school, funded equipment maintenance classes through the county extension office. She often said knowledge deserved the same care as machinery. Kevin Brooks changed too. The banker who once laughed across a crowded cafe became one of the strongest supporters of small family farms in Adams County. Young loan officers sometimes wondered why he always visited older farmers personally instead of judging them from paperwork. He would smile and tell them one story. Margaret's. Richard Ellis eventually started his own engineering consulting business. His first rule never changed. No project succeeds if honesty gets buried before the concrete. He framed that sentence above his office door. The old Farmel M remained in the red barn. Every spring, it still started after only a few turns of the crank. Children and grandchildren learned to drive it in the same pasture where the pipes had once slept beneath the soil. Margaret Lawson passed away peacefully in October 2003, at the age of 87, with her family beside her. She left the farm to her daughter, Helen Lawson Carter, who promised never to sell the western pasture. Not because it was the most productive land, but because it reminded everyone that patience could outlast pressure. Visitors still ask where the pipes were buried. Helen usually smiles, then points across the grass. You'd never know now. And that's exactly the way Margaret would have wanted it. Some people spend their lives trying to prove they're the smartest person in the room. Margaret Lawson never tried to prove anything at all. She simply protected what had been trusted to her until everyone else finally understood its value. Some things aren't protected by fences or contracts. They're protected by the character of the person standing beside them. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly did the right thing long after everyone else stopped paying attention, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. Have you ever cared for something others dismissed as worthless, only to see its value recognized years later? Share your story. I read every one. And if you'd like to hear about the Iowa farmer who refused to scrap a worn-out 1949 Oliver 88, only for that forgotten tractor to rescue an entire harvest decades later, make sure you come back. I think you'll enjoy that one just as much.